Well, hello. I guess we're at the end of the conference, and usually I often am earlier and I say, welcome to the conference, but this time I'm saying goodbye from the conference. But I've been enjoying it. And in fact, the things that I've been seeing here this week have, well, basically, I had a presentation fairly well worked out, and I've redone it about two-thirds. So different from what I had been planning to present that I hope I don't mess the time up too badly. But bear with me. The title is the same, though, and the basic point I wanted to make. One of the problems, I think, that has been with us from the beginning with domain-driven design is that either there's something about it that brings out the perfectionist in people. And people often get stuck trying to make perfect designs, and or maybe it draws perfectionists to it. It may be that. But whatever it is, I really want to attack that point tonight. So, basically, TDD is not for perfectionists. Or if it is, it's for reforming perfectionists, which maybe I'm a little bit of that, But let's stop that. Now, in order to stop doing that, though, you really have to think about it. It's not like, okay, I won't be a perfectionist anymore. You have to actually have some idea of how you're going to go about creating software that is well designed, but not perfect. Now, let's start with bounded context. This concept really originally, the purpose of it was to say, look, the environment in which we develop software is pretty messy. The projects are pretty rough and tumble, and we have to deal with a lot of things, a lot of legacy systems and external systems, and also other teams that may do things differently, a lot of stuff. And the bounded context is and yet, a model, the kind of clean, sharply defined concepts that we want to have, they can't really coexist with all that. So again and again, you see people trying to just replace everything, just have a total tabula rasa with everything clean and perfect for all time, which just never works, not only in software, but probably in anything really complex. Just to review, probably most people know what I mean by bounded context, and I know that there's been a lot of talk about it at the conference. But even so, I want to go through the definition a bit. I've pretty much defined it as a part of the software in which you have consistency, conceptual consistency. Of course, there are many kinds of boundaries and many kinds of consistency. But this is the consistency that when I say a particular word, I mean the same thing. Or if I talk about a relationship between two things, that relationship is defined the same way. Now, it's not perfect because this is being created by people, but within a bounded context, it should be pretty good. A bounded context has a boundary around it. I should be able to know if I'm a developer whether I'm in that boundary or outside of that boundary. And if I'm in that boundary, I know that I need to follow the rules that have been laid down for that bounded context. And if I'm out of that boundary, then I'm free of those rules. I might have to follow some other rule set that's been defined within another bounded context. And this freedom, or rather this boundary, creates freedom to define the rules that apply here. Not just what is our design, what are our names, and so on. But the architecture can be different within different bounded contexts. The process, because development process is never going to be uniform any more than design is. And that's all there is to it. I mean, now people then extend it and say, well, okay, so I pointed out, for example, that sometimes services, especially when they're very autonomously developed, as in the microservice movement, that a service development can be a good bounded context. But sometimes people sort of skip a few of the words in that sentence and they come up with, a service is a bounded context. That's not what I said, right? A service where we have autonomous development can be a bounded context if we're doing this. Or maybe it's not the service itself. Maybe it's sort of the certain spaces between the services, like all the messages that we use to make these 8 services communicate smoothly. I will define that interchange as a bounded context, and I will use it to define the messaging protocol between all the services that are involved. Not inside of those services necessarily. That's up to the people who own those contexts. So an interchange context then is a little bit less tangible. And there would be many forms that these bounded contexts take. Now, one of the common things that gets us slipping into perfectionism is, okay, we have a subdomain, we'll do the accounting within a bounded context called accounting, and we'll do the purchasing within a bounded context called purchasing, and so on. So these are subdomains, and we'll make bounded contexts that align with these, and a team will work on each one or whatever. And actually, that works well. That's a good thing to do when we can. But I'll get to in a few minutes why that isn't the same as saying that a bounded context should be aligned with a subdomain. And how about Conway's law? Certainly a big topic this week. And there's an obvious relationship between Conway's law and the concept of a bounded context, I think. And I want to talk about that in a minute. Here I'll just say, we want to set things up in a way that Conway's law is helping us, right? Sort of filling our sails. So we have to be kind of conscious of that force that is a real force on a software project. And especially we want to not get in the way of it, right? Not be flattened by trying to fight against the organizational structure. So let's just imagine that we have a system, and these are more or less, this is fresh software. And fresh software tends to follow Conway's law very closely. So we have a team responsible for credit cards, and we have a team responsible for cash accounts. And they each have a model. And the terminology is a little different. You see that over here they talk about the amount of a charge, and over there they talk about the debit of a withdrawal. And you could translate between these two. You could come up with a value for the balance of a checking account that would relate to the credit limit of a credit card. That may or may not be necessary. So we've got here alignment between a subdomain, the way that we've chosen to break down the business, the organizational structure, and the bounded contexts. But now, as tends to happen, there's a reorg. So the business says, well, wouldn't it be better to focus on the market segments? The difference between checking accounts or cash management accounts and credit cards isn't really the key to our business. The key is, for example, to address business accounts differently than personal accounts. The way we interact with the customer is different. The way we market it is different. The kinds of things these people need are different. So let's reorganize. And so we create a team that's focused on business accounts and a team that's focused on personal accounts. Now, so now what is the context? What do the bounded contexts look like? Well, they look exactly the same as they did before. There's no magic about a reorg that causes the software to restructure itself, right? The Conway's law will work if there's no software there, but if you reorganize, the software that's already there will resist the change. So now what we've got is something like this, where we have two teams that are sort of tugging at these two contexts. And the stewardship, no one's talked about it, as usual, as so often they don't, or they talk in kind of idealistic terms, where, well, we'll just coordinate and cooperate. And so they start to make changes. You know, this team makes a change, and that team makes a change. Now, this is a metaphor that I like to apply, because I think this is a familiar game here as well. All right, so who wins a three-legged race? Well, these kids are winning the three-legged race. They have a good balance between coordinating with each other and also running reasonably fast. And these guys, well, they've got good coordination, but they're just slow runners. And these guys might be fast runners, but they haven't coordinated well. So, you know, now, if we had a regular foot race, like just cut the cord and let all the kids run, who would win the race? You know, it's quite a different set of criteria, right? Let's say that it would be these guys. The actual fastest runners, independent of whether they can coordinate with another runner. So, in our software development, most of the time, it is not a competitive question. That is, internally, it's not a question of, do we want this team to be better than that team? We want both teams to succeed as well as possible. So what that means is that if you were independent, if each runner was running independently, they would all run faster. And fewer of them would trip and fall. Translating that back into the terms of our software development, you know, what does this trip and fall look like here? Well, you know, these guys are adding a feature, and those guys are making a change, and those guys add a feature, and those guys are changing. So there's a term people have used for a long, long time called the big ball of mud. And the big ball of mud is a way of describing software that has no structure that anyone could, you know, anyone would be willing to use the name for. And generally speaking, we don't enjoy working on software like that. But, you know, you can make incremental changes to it. And it comes about for various reasons. But one of the common reasons I observe is that there's not clear stewardship of software. There's multiple teams making changes to it. They don't fully understand what each other is doing, or they don't care enough about the long-term life of it. And it ends up a terrible mess. So then comes a concept called anti-corruption layers. So this is a kind of context relation, a kind of boundary that we might place between bounded contexts. And it's one of the ones I described in the book, and it's pretty popular. And basically it says, I have a bounded context, and there are forces that I think are going to cause it to become corrupted, to lose its clarity. One of those forces might be a reorg. More generally, I usually describe it in terms of, here's a big legacy system that's probably already a big ball of mud. And here's a new development team, or rather a team on a new development project. And part of the goal of this project is to develop a clean model that will help address some new important strategy. But if you just start doing that in the context of the big ball of mud, you will simply fail. It will never work. The big ball of mud is just incompatible with elegant models. So we build an anti-corruption layer. That is a software, an actual piece of software whose purpose is to communicate between our software and the other software. Now, it doesn't have to be with a big ball of mud. It can be with another nicely designed system, but that does not follow rules remotely like ours, right? It could be with external software that we have to import, and it might be of varying quality. It could be with, it could be many things. And so this picture is a garden wall, and on one side is a public street, and on the other side the garden, and there's a space, so there's a chance there for communication. So there are all kinds of metaphors for software, right? I've probably been responsible for one or two myself. And so let's look at another one. A community garden. So in a community garden, we have, different plots that are allowed to be gardened by different people. And you look at a typical community garden, and it doesn't look like a designed garden like, a Buckingham Palace garden or something. It's got, kind of wild variation within it. But there's an exuberance to a community garden. But community gardens are not just free-for-alls. They don't happen just because you say, well, here's some space and now everybody go and garden. They're actually coordinated. My partner and I, we signed up for a community garden a few years ago. And this is a picture of that one. And what makes the garden work? Well, partly there are some rules, some standards. For example, no invasive plants. Generally speaking, you can plant almost anything you want in your plot of a community garden, but there's a long list of prohibited plants because they tend to spread. So then there's some rules around the compost. If you're going to take your garden wastes and compost them, they have some compost heaps there, and there's rules about what you put where, and so on. There are a handful of rules. It's not onerous, but they're carefully selected rules. There's one rule so important and so, but kind of obvious that it's not even on the list, and that is you stay in your plot, right? You garden your plot. You don't go gardening other people's plots. But it's the most important rule. And then they provide some infrastructure too. They provide some tools and some water, like a water hose. Ours was trying to be all eco-friendly with a rain-fed watering system, and it was a kind of dry summer, so that didn't work out too well, but the concept was nice. A very important service they provided was coordination with the city and other, organizations. So, but there's a service that's fairly obvious, which is they allocate the plots and they decide who's gets to use this plot, and when that is no longer applicable, reassign a plot to someone else. So they don't really do much, right? There's the space, go at it, go plant your garden, follow these rules, but there's certain critical things in place that make sure that we have a good gardening experience. Now, this was the plot next to ours. And so this person showed up one day and kind of half-tilled, and then I didn't actually see them, but I could tell they came because then one day there were some little, the little planter packages with the plants in them, And they laid a few of those out, and then they never came again. And the plants sort of grew in their little packets and then died, and then the weeds grew and grew. And, well, that happens. That's the community garden equivalent of the big ball of mud. And except it's even worse, really, because the big ball of mud is actually quite useful. But, the thing is, then you were concerned about the boundary, right? I didn't want all the weeds that they were growing to come over into our garden. I spent, almost as much time pulling weeds at the border between the two gardens, probably, as all the rest of our garden. But, that happens. Now, one thing about it, so that's a terrible mess, and no one would like that. I'm sure they reassigned the plot to a different person the next year, right? But now the late summer garden, it doesn't look too tidy either. It looks a little messy. It's actually probably more structured than it looks. In the spring, it looked super tidy. Everything pin neat. But late summer, it looks a bit messy, but that's when it's actually at its most abundant, most productive, right? A lot of times, very productive and abundant things are kind of messy looking. There's a kind of underlying order to them that may not be so readily visible. I say this to some extent because we as a large class of software professionals who care about design, we tend to dismiss the legacy systems too quickly, I think. We don't appreciate them enough, appreciate what what they actually can do, how they've formed into the shape of the business. Not to say that those systems aren't creating obstructions as well, right? And it's not my thing to work on those. Well, okay, enough about big picture for a little bit. Let's talk about fine-grained design. When I say not everything will be well designed and we have to face imperfection, I also don't want to make it feel like I'm saying, well, there will be some really messy legacy systems, and then there'll be, within your bounded context, your absolutely perfect and pristine little system. Because that's not what I'm saying either. Within the well-designed parts, things won't be perfect. So I want to get really specific, and I want, so to get a specific example, I said, well, all right, let's look at something that's actually pretty well designed. It's the JodaTime library, which most Java developers will know about this at least a little bit. But it's just the library that gives you things, gives you date times and allows you ways of manipulating them. And it's been a library that people have used for many years, and an open source library that's been used for many years in Java, and recently was adopted into the Java standard libraries. So it's actually JavaTime now. But I'll call it JodaTime. So one of many features of this library is that you can take a time and you can add a period to it, as they call it, and get another time. So, for example, you could say, take a date, 2017, January 20th. And then you could take a period, let's say 1 month, and you can add those. You can say 2017, January 20th, plus 1 month is February 20th, right? So there you go. That's a nice, clear thing. And you can say plus 2 months, and you'll get March 20th. Now let me ask you this. January 30th plus 1 month, what is that? I mean, I could think of at least 2, probably 3 reasonable answers. And so probably some of the Java programmers know the answer, but I went in and checked to make sure, and so this is the answer. January 30th plus 1 month is February 28th. And although I think it's a reasonable default, but it still doesn't seem quite right to me. Are you with me on this? I mean, this seems like kind of fudging a little. It's not obvious, which is a characteristic I like my designs to have, if possible. And the rule isn't really conveyed by the name. So, I said that Joda time is pretty good, but it's not perfect. So for a starter, I'll just say, well, kudos to them for actually shipping something that's not perfect. I'll bet somebody in the Joda time development community said, hey, we can't ship this plus period feature. Look at this. I'll bet that happened. And then somebody else said, well, it's useful. It is true there are some quirks, but we need to get this thing out. And so they shipped it. And so for starters, I'll say they did the right thing. Joda time is extremely useful. And if we were as perfectionist as all that, it would have never been shipped, just like 90% of the open source projects. Did I say 90%? I'm an eternal optimist. So I'm glad that they shipped it. But now that, acknowledging that, let's look at what might have been done even without fixing the problem to make it a little more satisfying or something. Or let's say to maybe make the future path better. So I'll talk about honest names. So if you look at this, that doesn't sound like plus. Plus is the wrong word for that. And if I start thinking about, well, what could the name have been? And I do this, I'll just have my notebook. Sometimes you'll find pages that are just long lists of possible names of something that I'm puzzling about. So maybe you could say, well, it's sort of plus rounded, right, to the nearest month. Or it's not just month, of course, but any irregular kind of time period. Or maybe it's a constrained plus. Or maybe it's plus with a ceiling. I can think of a lot of possible names, and I would just come up with lots of names. And I'd brainstorm names with other people. And then I would give it one of these type of names. The thing is that I think there's value in giving awkward concepts awkward names. It not only, you don't really want to call a function in your library plus with ceiling. And that's maybe a good thing because that makes your mind keep coming back to it, right? But you want something honest, and the awkwardness is flagged. Plus sounds elegant. Plus sounds uniform. So it misleads. Let's look a little more at this. So we have March 30th plus 1 month is April 30th. And March 31st plus 1 month is also April 30th. That's the same thing again. But here's an interesting one. April 30th plus 1 month is May 30th. What do you think March 31st plus 2 months is? Well, you won't be able, you can guess, and you'll have 2 guesses, and one of them will be right. So it's May 31st, which seems as right, at least as right as the other one. So why does this feel so wrong? I think that It feels wrong because when we hear the word plus, it brings to mind a lot of things. It's a well-known abstraction and usually involves the concept of associativity. And this is not associative. So, if you add 1 month plus 1 month without parentheses, you get a different answer than if you put parentheses around the 2 1 months. And things we call plus usually would give the same answer for those two things. Not always. So, all right. So, actually, there are lots of very well-defined and useful operations that do not have associativity. It's not like I'm saying, oh, all your operations should be associative. Far from it. What I am saying is that maybe we don't want to call those plus. Not that you couldn't define a plus operation as not being associative, but you'll have to tell people. We could call it, let's add some possible names. How about plus non-associative? So I think that, yeah, we need a name for this thing. And it needs to be something that doesn't lure people into expecting things that they won't get. Because the truth is, it's a perfectly valuable, useful feature. Well, so I would just take one of these names and I would use it. And I would be a little embarrassed about it in the library, but it would be out. But it would also be sort of flagged as, this is a nice operation, but a little bit awkward. Now, there are other operations, similar looking ones. The periods themselves can be combined with a plus operation. So you can say a period plus a period gets a period. 1 month plus 2 months is 3 months. And the thing is, as far as I can tell, but I haven't exhaustively tested it or anything, but as far as I can tell, this actually does follow associativity. So, 1 month plus 2 months is the same as 2 months plus, or rather, 1 plus 2 plus 3, or wherever you put the parentheses, it comes out the same, as far as I can tell with a cursory examination. So, probably plus is a good name for that, And so I'd keep that one. So basically, I'd have something like, period plus period, but I might have, time plus-ish rounded ceiling period. I probably wouldn't use all that. One of those would be enough to mark it. But that keeps something's going to niggle in the back of your mind, just keep jiggling, possibly for a long time. And then there's always the chance that in a later iteration of the library, someone comes up with a nice idea for a different model or a different name, maybe. One day, you might be playing Candyland. And I don't know if people play Candyland here. It's a game when I was very young. It's like a game that I think it says on the box like ages 4 and up. And basically you draw a card, it has a number, you go bump, 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 bump that many spaces. And then the other person draws a card and it has a number and you go bump, bump, bump that many spaces. That's it. Now, here's what's interesting about this game. So suppose that you were on this, you're near the beginning and you're on this purple square. And let's say you draw a 6. So you're going to go bump, 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 bump. Right? That will take you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 over to that purple square by Lord Licorice there. Okay. Now let's say you drew a 3 and then another 3. You draw a 3. In this turn, you go bump, 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 and you're in that red square. And then all of a sudden, You go zip right over the rainbow trail. In your next turn, you draw another 3. So bump, bump, bump. Now you're in that red square, and you're already almost over to that peanut brittle house or whatever. So what that says is that these moves that you make in Candyland are not associative. I can have 2 moves of 3 each. And if I advance 3 and then 3, that is not the same as advancing 6. So, that's interesting. There's a system that has this sort of, progression in it, and yet it isn't associative. So, it makes me start thinking, well, okay, another metaphor that a calendar is like a board game. So, we have rules to move game pieces around that are less regular than just, you could make a game even simpler than Candyland, I guess, that had associativity, but I think even 4-year-olds might get bored with that game. But here's the thing, we would not call those things plus, or plus rounded, plus with ceiling. Well, we have other names. We say things like, move forward so many spaces, or maybe advance. So let's try out that language with our time library. So instead of saying time plus ceiling period is a time, we could say plus advance period gives us another time. The nice thing about this is that the term advance doesn't make me think about associativity. I don't expect that it will be like addition, where I guess I'm sort of I'm prepared for a rule, like if you end up rolling over a month, you stop at the end of the month. It doesn't tell me what that rule is, but it tells me that there might be rules like that. If I say, well, how would that, maybe there are other words I could use, things more time related, like later. So I could try out, time later by 1 month. Gives me a time. Again, later by a month doesn't suggest the same things, to me at least, that plus does. So actually, I haven't changed the functionality at all. I think I have changed the model, though. At this point, I think I've changed the model, because we've subtly, without hardly noticing it, we have changed the concept of that operation. We were thinking of it as a mathematical operation, plus, like, at least something like plus. But now we're thinking of it as movement through some kind of a sequence. And sequences can be much more arbitrary. So I would be happy to have advance or later as the operator. At that point, I would even, I wouldn't consider those particularly awkward names. Okay, so anyway, there is that was one point, basically that I wanted to make about how I would respond to these imperfections in the model. Not by trying to perfect it, but by trying to make it more honest about itself. Not hide kind of awkward things under pretty names. Now, let me move on. So sometimes it isn't so much that your model is a little awkward in a spot. Maybe it's just a little incomplete, or can't handle all the cases or something. I remember that I was on a project once, and we came up with a really elegant model. It was easily understood by business people, and it could handle like well over 90% of our cases. And it had almost mathematical kind of clarity to it. but it only handled, you know, I don't know, 90 or 95% of the cases. And we did have to handle all the cases. So what do you do? So one thing we did was we explored other possible models, that could handle more of the cases. Most of those models were rather awkward. Sometimes they contrived like, weird little appendages. Sometimes they were just a whole different concept. There was one model I remember could handle a much higher number of cases, but it was sort of very abstract and it didn't communicate to the business people at all. So I considered that to be a weakness. So anyway, even with it, we were stuck with a model that didn't cover all the cases. And we had some very awkward looking things that did cover all cases. What to do? So what we actually decided to do, we created a function. And we called the function cases we haven't figured out yet. So when one of these requests came in, we could identify which category it was in, and we would either put it through the really elegant model that handled nearly everything. And by that, I don't mean happy path. I mean it could handle all sorts of strange cases, just not all of them. So we would put most of those things through there, and then the other ones we put through this other function. And this other function had a funny rule. We said, no abstractions. Of course, I'm sure we must have had some abstractions, but no high-level concepts here. Use if, then, else logic so that we don't start creating a whole other kind of weird, awkward model here. And those if, then, else's did not proliferate too wildly because we already, remember, we're only covering a few cases, right? And each one of the cases we didn't know how to handle was basically covered by one of these things. So basically, if you were saying, oh yeah, we can't handle the case where this and this and this, so, well, add a clause. If this, this, and this, then do that. Now, writing a whole system like that would just be, not domain-driven design at all. That would not be modeling. It would just be actually the way lots of people do write software. And it can work. And in simple cases, it might be the best. But what about a complex case like this, where we have a model that we like, but that doesn't quite cover everything, or we have a model that we don't like, that does cover everything, etc.? This was the trade-off that we made, and I thought it was a good trade-off. And in fact, what would happen sometimes is as we saw the cases, remember, as they accumulate, and you can kind of get some sense of what you haven't figured out, I would start to get glimmers of like, I think I might see another model that could handle more of these cases. And I could have conceived of a situation where we might have a couple of elegant models and still a little spill zone where 0.1% of the cases that we just couldn't handle would go in there with if, then, else, if, then, else. But I don't know how that came out, actually. A lot of times I'm involved in a project for a while and then I don't see the very end. And I suspect that it looks exactly the same as when I left, but with a few more clauses, because one of the things this allowed us to do was to move on to actually complete that functionality and ship it. And that's what you've got to do, right? You have to get stuff out. We have to get over this idea that design is something which you invest some extra time in up front, and then it gets paid off in the long run. I don't think that's what really happens. I think most of the time we invest up front and don't get paid off in the long run because the investment up front is just all spinning our wheels, trying to imagine the perfect model, or trying to find answers when we haven't got our hands dirty enough to really understand the problem yet. So you figure some stuff out and you get it shipped with a model that's the best one you can come up with right now, and with some honest names and maybe a spill zone here and there, and then you move on and you ship and repeat the cycle. Whoops. Whoops. The spill zone is kind of a specific example of a principle I would apply more broadly. If you've got an abstraction that's really leaky or an abstraction that's really confusing or vague, just don't use it. It's better to just program with if then else than to program with something that gives the illusion of an elegant model, but actually has to do all that same stuff through more hidden means. I mean, if you have an abstract interface, but then when you actually get the value, you have to check instance of to see what class it really is, or whatever. Well, then, that's no abstraction. That's just something that will make your thing look superficially like a nice model. It will actually get in the way of finding a model that will really help. Better to be honest. If you don't have a good abstraction, then don't use any abstraction. I didn't say perfect, though. Use the imperfect abstractions that actually help. Now, there's two different things I'm kind of talking about a little bit at once. One, I've been talking about how in the actual production system, we have imperfections, and we need ways of sort of highlighting them. We need ways of separating different types of, the messier bounded context from the nice ones, ways of sort of marking an abstraction as having some problems. In the discovery phase, exploratory phase, things are messy, and there's no reason to fight the mess at all. This, of course, is a picture from Alberto Brandolini's workshop earlier this week. And anything Alberto is involved in is always extremely messy. And out of it comes tremendous creative productivity. And of course, out of it can come real clarity as well. Right? Just because the process is messy doesn't mean the end result is messy. So what I've talked about up to now is mostly the part of the actual end result that I don't like, that's not perfect, and saying we got to go ahead and ship and flag them. But this part, there's no reason to resist it at all. No reason to try to make this seem orderly at all. And people do. People say, well, what's the first step? To getting a good domain-driven design model, what's the first step, and what's the second step, and the third? DDD isn't like that. This is a diagram I, made a few years ago called the whirlpool. I called it that because we've always used the waterfall method, or everyone likes the waterfall method, And I said, all right, if people want a violent water metaphor, I will give them one. And so the waterfall method, you can see why it appeals to people, because you go in a straight line, you go along the river, metaphorically, go along the river and you go a little faster, always in a straight line, and then at some point you're going down the waterfall, and so you go faster and faster, and then you hit the bottom and the boat breaks on the rocks and everyone dies. So it's a very good metaphor because it describes what really happens. Now, the whirlpool model, I thought, well, okay, I think this is also a good metaphor because it also describes what can happen on projects where we do modeling and design. The risk of a whirlpool, you'll never get, carried down a cliff and crash on the rocks. But what can happen is you'll get trapped in the currents and you can't get out, and you just eventually become exhausted, and then you just slip under the waves and drown. That's what happens to design projects if they get too perfectionist. If they don't do this thing I'm talking about, it just saying, this isn't perfect, but it has value in it, and it's time to ship. How can we do a few things to make sure that we don't just hide the issues that we have, and now let's get it out. Actually, I don't even like to make things quite as tidy as I could make them. I must admit that when I'm still not completely don't completely feel settled about a certain concept or a certain term, I actually kind of like to leave a few loose ends around. Here's an example. Let's suppose we had a method in this application that was doing something with, now at this point we have modified the time library to say later rather than plus. And later, I kind of like that word actually. But I still maybe don't feel entirely settled. And I think, well, I'll just keep a little bit of the jangling going for a while. So we've used the probably preferable name in the library, later by. But here in a less public place where we're doing application logic, I've got a method that says advance to, because that word advance didn't seem bad either. And then sometimes when I'm, walking in the woods thinking about stuff, and I'll think, maybe advance would have been a better name. It's more like the board game. And so I've still got it in there. And someday we could refactor this away. But it'd be hard to refactor the library if we decided someday we really like that. But another thing that happens is, see, that if you don't resolve all those tensions, then somehow you keep thinking a little bit, and sometimes you get a real conceptual breakthrough that really does take you to a different place. So this one, maybe we don't even need to try to do this, but still, I know that I am not as tidy a coder as a lot of people are. And so I remember at a few points in my life, I thought, I should do it like those people do. They're writing, I'll do all these behavior preserving transformations, and I'll refactor names completely and blah, 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 and make everything very consistent. And then I slipped away from it again, and then I'd do it again, and I thought, boy, I must be really lazy. And then I realized it wasn't laziness. I actually, when everything was tidied up to that degree, I felt like my creativity disappeared. The way I thought about the design changed. Like it was a done thing that could never be changed, that's me. Maybe not everybody's like that. But I think it might be okay to have some tension, even in the code. Now here's one that will upset some people. Dry. Don't repeat yourself. I don't believe in it. Or what I really believe in it, I do believe in it within a single bounded context. I think it is a rule that works well if you are working within one of those very well-designed, well-bounded areas where we are trying to make a very tight model and design. And in that kind of context, not only are we going to try to attain that level of perfection, but we are also, it actually makes sense. So when you talk about between bounded contexts, first of all, it isn't practical. Think what it would really mean. If I'm developing a feature, now I don't just mean like copy-paste, although I might be okay with that in some situations. But I don't really mostly mean copy-paste. I mean, I'm developing a feature, and somewhere else in this enterprise system, there is a similar feature. It has a different name. I don't know how I would even know it was there. The only way I would even know it was there is if I had a high level of communication with everybody else in the whole development organization, which I just won't. Or if we had a big infrastructure of oversight, lots of architects roaming around, approving everything you do after having exhaustively looked for anything similar that might be a duplication. Now, does duplication really sound so bad? So here's two bounded contexts. Okay, here's a kitchen and a bathroom. And actually, there are a lot of commonalities. They use very much of the same infrastructure, right? They both need water and plumbing, you know, more so than any other part of the house, right? In many ways, bathrooms and kitchens parallel. And so let's take a specific feature. In both of these contexts, we have a way of disposing of solid waste. Okay, in the kitchen, most modern kitchens, the sink has a garbage disposal. So if you drop food down into the drain and you push the button, and it will grind up the food and it goes down into the sewer. And in the bathroom, we have a toilet, and I don't need to explain to you, I think, how toilets dispose of solid waste. So, shall we refactor? And we need one way of disposing of solid waste. All right, so maybe we agree that we are not going to do that. This dry is just a principle, it's like a heuristic that I think is a good heuristic for certain kinds of bounded contexts internally, where we're trying to get that kind of consistency. It's not even a good heuristic for all bounded contexts. If you have one where things are a little free for all, where you're sort of halfway to a big ball of mud, or not quite there, but it certainly doesn't apply between bounded contexts. Even if it weren't for, the grossness factor, there's the coordination overhead. Because if we do develop that feature, remember I said, I'm developing a feature, and someone in a totally other part of the organization has already developed a feature that is very similar. Not a feature, but say a capability within the system. And so we're going to factor that out and share it. And this means that instead of running a regular foot race, we are now running a three-legged race. And I have to stay coordinated with those people. And if I do that with another one, then I guess it's sort of a four-legged race, because I'll have one person tied to this angle and another one tied to that ankle, and we'll all be running like that. We don't even try to do that at kids' fairs, because they just all fall down, and that would be that. So I just don't believe in that. So I guess I'll review a little and then wrap up. There is a cycle that happens, I suppose, where a cohesive team will build some coherent software in a well-defined context. But then a reorg happens, or just the original team moves on maybe, and the new team doesn't quite understand it. Anyway, the software starts to degrade, and eventually can't really do what you need to do. You can't innovate around it the way you'd like to. So we hopefully at some point kind of create a bubble context, as I sometimes call it, where we have a anti-corruption layer, and it protects it from the other system, and we start developing fresh. And so we're back to the cohesive team working in a nice, coherent context. And then, of course, the cycle repeats over and over. I think this is probably just natural. This is just the way it is. It might actually happen a little less if we were less perfectionist. Because not only would I be, like in a reorg, I might be thinking about, well, what's going to happen to this software now? It's not going to magically partition into these elegant new subdomains that the business has come up with. So we might create new contexts to deal with these new approaches, and maybe actually build an anti-corruption layer to protect the legacy system. Because the legacy system at this point is a valuable and coherent piece of software. It just works in an outdated way. So we create a translation between it and the newer stuff. And so you can look at it both ways. What's corrupting what? Sometimes the new can corrupt the old as well. And then you end up somewhere, a big sprawling system with lots of choices that you'd rather, not have made. And inside of the bounded context, I'm sure that if you talk to the people who actually designed the Jota library, they would say, oh, every one of them would probably say, well, this is the thing I most wish we had done differently, or that's the thing I most wish that we had done differently. But nonetheless, the truth is they did a good job. They shipped. These things are path dependent, and we can't always, and a lot of times it's like we want to start fresh. We want to say, well, if I knew then what I know now, and I do know what I know now, so I'll just build everything new. Even context boundaries, like, I talked about building those divisions between different contexts and a translation layer and so on. Even those things, time moves on from. In New England, where I live, and I'm sure in lots of places, they used to mark property lines with rocks that they would get out of their field and just pile them up on the edge or kind of make a little wall. Well, here's a case that I come across this now and then walking in the woods, and there's one of those things just running through. It's no longer dividing property. Maybe it's all a park now, but this is probably two different farm fields 100 years ago or something, I don't know. So even the anti-corruption layers might kind of get passed by, be compromised so many times they're no longer really working, and just sort of the two contexts that they were separating merge into one big ball of mud, and the former anti-corruption layer is part of that big ball of mud, and so you wouldn't dare change it either. And that's just part of what happens. We have to be less hubristic, and then we will produce better results. What I am really saying is, if we want to produce beautiful designs, we have to be less perfectionist. And a lot of the things we tend to do, and I say this because I think that DDD has, in reality, contributed to this feeling that everything should be so perfect. Though it wasn't my intention, but I think to a degree, you have to take responsibility for the actual outcome of things, not just what you wanted to have happen, right? And so I'm saying this is hubris, and it also doesn't lead to the outcome we want. It doesn't lead to better design. What will lead to better design is a more pragmatic approach and more humble. And another thing is, I think we need to broaden our aesthetic. I myself have a tendency to prefer that sort of clean design, the model that has, sharp edges and everything lines up. I mean, I'm the one who just got upset that the plus operator in Jota time isn't associative. So that's me. But, you broaden your aesthetic a little and you can appreciate the things that are going on in other kinds of software. In the legacy system that's been running for 20 years and has somehow kept the business running all that time. This is a picture that was in Rebecca Wurzbach's presentation this morning, and I asked her if I could use it, because this is a tree. She took a picture of this tree in Kyoto, Japan, and it's obviously a very old tree. I think most people would look at this and say, this is a beautiful thing. There's something very satisfying about this tree. But it's all gnarly, nothing's straight. And the thing is, can't even hold itself up. It's propped up with these posts, with this careful protector around the limb. Now, if we looked at this tree the way we usually look at legacy software, we would say, oh, look at that mess. Look at that gnarly old tree. It can't even hold itself up. Ha ha. What we need to do is we need to cut this thing down and plant a fresh new tree that will be perfectly straight and strong and people can climb on it. And that would be a crime, right? I think most people would just say, oh, how could you do that? Now, I'm not saying legacy software is, like this exactly. But if we who have a tendency to overappreciate the other kinds of aesthetics and underappreciate this, if we deliberately bias ourselves in that sort of direction, then I think it would be a healthy thing, right? To look at that legacy system and say, well, I really don't like it, and I'm sure I never am going to like it, but can I learn to see what is there, to see the value that's there? And then when I'm building my own stuff, be a little easier on, myself. Don't beat yourself until the thing is perfect, because then you won't ship. And what we do sometimes do is just careen between perfectionism and then, oh my God, we've got to ship something, so we just hack out something horrible and ship that, and just careen back and forth between these two extremes. What I'm saying is we'll get a much better result if we're more conscious about this trade-off, and even have techniques for what we do when we're not entirely satisfied with the model that we've got. So thank you for your attention, and thanks for a great conference.